Hello and welcome to Ask Coach G Live, our monthly workshop where we talk about a topic and take your questions. I want you to think of it as a free session with me where because I enjoy simplifying the complex science of behavior, make this learning available to you so that you can have practical tips that you can use immediately starting today to improve your mental and emotional well-being. All right, so okay, here we go. So hi, if you're here and you haven't met me, this is a good opportunity for me to introduce myself. My name is Gbemi, or Coach G, as my clients like to call me. I'm a psychotherapist. I'm licensed in the state of Texas as a licensed marriage and family therapist and licensed professional counselor. I'm also a nationally certified counselor, and I am board certified in applied behavior analysis. I have a burning desire to fill the gap that the limited access to mental and emotional health has created, because I genuinely believe that people, even when it is priced out of their pockets, should be able to get access to help. And all of this is my desire to close that gap and make the learning available to as many people as I can, because learning all of these things have changed my life, and I genuinely believe that it can change yours too. So this virtual village, the Untangled Together Virtual Village, is a free community that I set up to help us to achieve 3 resources: community, access to my expertise, and resources. All of these things available to you for free so that you can improve your mental and emotional health. So we do the essential work of exploring, identifying, and getting unstuck from old patterns so that you can become the version of yourself that you desire and deserve to be. So today, what are we untangling? Boundaries. We talk about the meaning of boundaries, the importance and the significance, what they're not, what they are, and you'll learn practical tips that you can use today, and we'll also answer your questions. So let's jump right into it. What are boundaries? Very, very simply, and without overcomplicating it, boundaries are limits. The limits that you set for yourself, for your own life and conduct within relationships. Boundaries are like, I want you to think of them as railings. Like maybe you're on a bridge and you're walking on a bridge that's over a body of water or over a road. That road needs railings. It should have railings. Those are what boundaries are, right? They kind of keep you safe from harm and they guide you in the right direction. So if you're taking 3 steps to the right, the railing lets you know that, hey, this is the area we walk within to make sure that we're safe. So that's what boundaries are. Guidelines, right? That keep us safe from harm and guide us in the right direction, Why do we need boundaries? We need boundaries because they help to keep us safe. Without boundaries, we will be unclear about what's okay and what is not. And the side effect of that, which is what often happens to people, is that you will be exhausted and you will be resentful because you didn't create guidelines around what's okay and what is not. And also, if we're going to make this culturally relevant, you may have grown up in a culture where boundaries aren't really a thing, because as a good, air quotes, good person, you are expected to perform in certain ways to meet requirements that have been set for you prior. Before you were born, before you entered into the world even, there were certain requirements and expectations about what your conduct should be, what your behavior should be. I see in the comments, somebody says, firstborn daughter here nodding. Exactly. There are already ideas about what your role and place in the society is, right? And so you show up in this world, and because you are not responsible for your family of origin or how you were raised, you grow up following the script that was written for you, the guidelines that other people have created about your behavior, right? But as you grow up and grow into your own person, you may or may not like those guidelines, right? You then come into your own and start to expect other people to not have created those guidelines for you, or for them to understand that those guidelines don't work for you. What's the problem with that? I want you to put your answers in the chat. What's the problem with growing up, running a script that has been written for you, and then as you grow older, realizing that that script isn't working so much anymore? What then happens? What do you do with all of that? Finding out that the script that was written for you. Let me give you an example. Firstborn sons should, girls must, women are supposed to, husbands are required to. As the last born, you are the one in charge of. As the woman on this panel, you are the one supposed to. Do you see how all those guidelines already exist? And depending on how conforming or non-conforming you are, you just go with it. You just keep doing it. But at some point, you're like, but I don't want to do this. I don't want to be this person, right? And then we now, so often, it's the symptoms that make us realize that there's a problem, right? However, I'm saying that perhaps if you knew that at some point in your life, as you come into adulthood, you are responsible for making your own guidelines and rule book, your own guidelines and rule book within the context of your existing relationship as you become your own person. It literally is your responsibility. But guess what? As with many things that had to do with mental and emotional health, nobody taught us. So here we are, dealing with the side effects of learning gaps we perhaps didn't know that we didn't have, right? Or that we might even still be blissfully unaware. So we are mad at everybody for having all these expectations of us, mad at everybody for crossing our boundaries. Do we even have boundaries? Do we know what they are? Or are we just upset that people aren't doing what we expect them to do? Which is what is ironic about boundaries. What's ironic about boundaries is that we are often oblivious of how we're crossing other people's boundaries, but critically aware of how other people are crossing ours. So as we share the world with others who perhaps love us and who we genuinely love, it becomes important for everybody to personally determine what their boundaries are so that we can then live this better quality life because we've made our own personal guideline and rule book that works for us because somebody else's guidelines may not work for us. So I'm looking in the chat. The script was selfish. Absolutely, because people are making rule books for what benefit them and they are writing guidelines for other people based on their own benefit, right? It doesn't honor our needs. We become uncomfortable in our own skin. Exactly. When people are making rule books, they're often making rule books and guidelines that honor them, not so much the rule book and guidelines that honor others, right? So you're absolutely correct. Yes, no identity, right? Because who are you? What do you want? What kind of life do you want for yourself? So it's possible to not have any identity of your own because you're following a script. Yeah, it took me a long time to wriggle out of this to be my own person, right? It can be a journey. And look, no matter what stage you are in that journey, I want to encourage you to recognize that that journey is part of your story. And at whatever point you decide to pivot, that becomes the today of the rest of your life, right? So yes, it might be unfortunate that we didn't know up until this point, but well, now we know and we can make better choices. Yeah, someone says it can cause perceived rebellion. I like the air quotes because that's true. Because as you start to assert yourself and design your own life, the people who have written their rule book for you or who assume that your life is supposed to be guided by the rule book they wrote, they may not like it, right? So yes, it can cause perceived rebellion. So that's what boundaries are, guidelines to keep you safe. Without them, you're very likely going to be overextended and stressed out because you're living by someone else's guidelines, right? So let's move on. What are boundaries and what are they not? Trying to go to the next slide. If this thing will let me. Okay, there we go. What boundaries are? This part is very critical, and I want you to pay attention because this is where we often miss it. Boundaries are guidelines we make for ourselves. Who do we make boundaries for? Please put the answer in the chat. Who do we make boundaries for? Yeah, you're absolutely correct. We make boundaries for ourselves. I want you to think of boundaries as your own personal code of conduct, right? Or imagine that you're a company. You're setting up a company. When you set up a company, you decide when your opening hours are and when your closing hours are, what kind of services you provide, who your ideal client is, right? So if you go to a company and let's say you're going to a bank, right? And you get there at 4:15 and the security guard says, we close at 4. And you then say to the security guard, according to my own guidelines of when banks should open and close, you people are not supposed to be closed at 4. You are supposed to close at 5. What are they likely to say to you? What are the security guards likely to say to you? Or perhaps the owner of the company? Please leave the answer in the chat. Because you are upset at them that how can a bank be closing at 4 o'clock? Who do they think they are? Right? I like this answer in the chat. She said, Madam, please leave this place. Because they're going to look at you and be like, who do you think you are that you get to set the code of conduct for this company? That's exactly what boundaries are. The company gets to decide, right, what they do. Exactly. So if you think of yourself as an individual, you think of yourself as somebody whose responsibility it is to develop and set guidelines for your own self. So when you speak about boundaries, please be clear. Because I often hear people talk about boundaries a lot and they're like, everybody, like, people don't even respect other people's boundaries. They're just crossing a boundary. When people cross a boundary, you cut them off. Quick question. The boundary is not about other people's behavior. It is about our own behavior. So if you hear anything that says, this is what other people must do, is that a boundary? Please put your answer in the chat. A boundary that discusses other people's behavior, right? Is it a boundary? The answer is no. Thank you. I see the answer in the chat. So I'm going to give you an example and I'm going to let you say boundary or not boundary in the chat. Are you guys ready? Give me a thumbs up. Let me know if you're ready. So I can give you a very practical example that you can apply. Okay, I see the thumbs up in the chat. So if I say, anybody who comes to this office after 4 p.m. will be arrested. Is that a boundary? I see a yes. I see another yes. I see a no. I see a yes. I see a yes. I see a no. Okay, I love that. I like the mixed responses. Yeah, okay. Should I go ahead and answer? The boundary is discussing other people's behavior because it says anybody who comes to this office after 4 p.m., right? However, it then also says will be arrested, right? Which then speaks of what you are going to do, right? If it is a boundary, it starts with, in this office, we close at 4. Because it is about what you are going to do, your personal code of conduct for who? Please put the answer in the chat. Who is that code of conduct for? It is for myself. So a boundary is a rule that you have made for your own self, which is this office closes at 4. Right? So you know it is not a boundary because it is not a rule to dictate other people's behavior. Because, and I want you to write this down, other people's behavior will always in caps, other people's behavior will always be outside of your control. What do you think about that? Other people's behavior will always, in the human services, we refrain from using always and never, because those are extremes and there are always exceptions to those rules. However, this is one exception where other people's behavior, because they have free will always be outside of our control because they're the ones who choose what they're going to do. So a boundary does not dictate other people's conduct. A boundary dictates your own conduct. So you declare your rule for your own self that you have made for your own self that's based on your values, right? You can then say, if you cross the boundary, here is what I am going to do. Not, you must not cross the boundary. What's the problem with telling people not to cross the boundary or insisting that they must never cross the boundary? Or saying, if you are a good person, you will never cross the boundary. What's the problem with that kind of thinking? Tell me, I'm monitoring the chat because I really would like to hear what you think. What's the problem with making your boundary about other people's behavior or saying, well, if they're a good person, then they would never do that? I like that answer because they might not know our boundaries, right? And we can't control what other people do, right? Because who's in charge of the code of conduct? For your own organization, that's you, right? I like these answers. Somebody also says you're challenging their own boundaries. Exactly. Exactly. Because boundaries are for us and not for them. Exactly. Also, you might be projecting. I like that. Because when you create a boundary, you might literally be putting up a rule for somebody who was used to living differently. So they can feel some type of way, right? So let's just be clear. A boundary is about your conduct and your behavior. It is not a rule for other people's behavior. It just sets out your own guideline for how you conduct yourself, right? Also, boundaries are not set in stone. The reason boundaries are not set in stone is because you're a person and circumstances in life are going to change. And so what that means is that when circumstances change, you have to be able to adapt to the circumstance. So what is a boundary today can very well change tomorrow if the circumstances change. So for example, let's say COVID happened and new social distancing rules were made, right? So if you set a boundary around the time of COVID, that anybody who wants to come into my house must wear a mask, right? I require, so I'm going to check what I just said. When I say anybody coming into my house must wear a mask, that sounds like a rule for them, right? So if I say it accurately, what would I say? I'd like to see your answer in the chat. Anybody coming into my house must wear a mask. Is that a boundary or a rule? What do you guys think? It's a rule. Thank you. Overwhelmingly correct. I see all the responses. Thank you. That's a rule. Yeah, because it is describing other people's behavior. If you were to reframe that as a boundary, what would you say? What might you say? I like that. Boundary would be, I don't let anyone into my house without a mask. I like that. Or masks are required here. Do you see that? In my house, masks are required, right? let me tell you the challenge with the I don't let and I can't allow and I will not allow. It still sets the other person as the center of the conversation. Remember, boundaries are for ourselves. So one good way to know that something is a boundary is that you are going to be talking about who. Who would you be talking about if it's a boundary? Myself. So let's reframe. Tell me how you would write that boundary, how you will speak on the boundary. So maybe a boundary around, there's some people who don't like shoes indoors, like outside shoes inside. How would you describe that if you were talking about a boundary? I'm grateful that you guys are participating because I can see that you guys get it. So how would you describe a boundary around outside shoes indoors? Okay, I see that comment. If you want to come into my house, please take off your shoes. I'm asking you to reframe it as talking about the guideline that you have. This one is funny. I'll call police for anyone bringing outside shoes indoors. Okay, I see. Leave your shoes at the door or we will get problems. I'm still, or let's just talk outside. This is the correct one. I got an accurate one. No shoes indoors, please. Shoes are not allowed beyond the door. More, there's a specific one I'm looking for, and it starts with your rule about your house, right? Shoes are not allowed beyond the door. Yeah, people really are strict. I have provided inside slippers, please. No shoes inside this house. I do not allow outside shoes in my home. You see, when the sentence starts with I'm encouraging you to follow it with what you allow, because a boundary is your guideline about what is okay for you. So much of boundaries are usually about outside behavior. I'm asking you to determine what your rule inside. So for example, the bank doesn't say nobody is allowed in after 5. The bank says we're open from 8 to 4. All right. Thank you, guys. No shoes inside this home. Please pick up a pair of socks for comfort. This person is so considerate. I love it. Somebody says this is a shoes off household. Do you guys get it? DJ says I am. I agree. I only allow inside shoes in my house. Do you guys see the difference? In this house, we only use positive and affirming language. Is different from in this house, right? Thank you, team, for taking care of that. In this house, we only use positive language, right? Do you see that? That's the boundary. It's different from I don't allow people curse in my house. Are we on the same page? Let me know that you can tell the difference. In this house, we don't swear. In this house, we only use positive language, right? Can you guys tell the difference? Right, because you want to make sure that the boundary is describing your own guidelines. I like the question about being confused, and I'm happy to clarify. I just want you to think of it as very simple. If you are an organization, right, you set the rules and guidelines, the code of conduct for that organization. So you are a person. A boundary is about what you like. Does that make sense? Are you guys with me? A boundary is about what you like and what's acceptable for you. So if you think about it as you are creating a, how would I put it? If you think about it as you are creating a code of conduct, a code of conduct describes what is going on. A code of conduct does not begin with what people are not allowed to do or what should not be permitted. Does that make sense? Let me know if you understand. So basically what I like and what I don't like exactly, right? That's how you think about it. What are we allowed to do here? That is why a boundary is based on your values. When you are discussing and you are talking about other people and other people's behavior, then that means that you are centering them. All right, I like that Toyosi clarified that I don't understand. I want you to think about let's use the bank example that we used earlier. When a bank sets their opening and closing time, do they start setting their opening and closing time from nobody is allowed to come in here after 6 o'clock? Or do they state the hours they are allowed to be open? What do you guys think? They state their hours, right? So that's how I want you to think about your boundaries as, what am I okay with? I'm not saying that you will not include things you are not okay with, but if you remember that a boundary is your own personal guideline about your relationships, even when you say what you don't want, it becomes your responsibility to say, what does this tell me about what I want? Then you front load with what you want. So for example, like the shoes example, I don't just say, I don't allow shoes in this house. I can reframe that to, this is a shoes off household, right? So I'm going to keep it moving. So when you think about a boundary, think of it as your guidelines for your conduct in relationships, which is your own rule book for what you allow and what you don't allow. So there are different types of boundaries. There are porous boundaries. So if you think of you having a circle around yourself. So if you think of boundaries as a guardrail around you that says what is okay and what is not okay, right? What happens with that guardrail is that if you're not careful, it can become a fence that doesn't allow the things that you want in. Let me know if you understand what I mean. That boundary can become a fence that doesn't let what you want in because you became hyper-focused on what you don't want or what you are not allowing in. So you can end up with what we call rigid boundaries, which aren't helpful, which are just as unhelpful as having porous boundaries, which is boundaries that allow anything and everything in, right? So what you want to have are boundaries that are firm and that are based on your values, because when you do that, what happens is that you're allowing what you want based on what you have predetermined is okay. That's how you handle that. So that's how boundaries work. And I hope that that clarifies it for you. So we're going to go next into question and answer so that way we can take, and I'm going to look at the chat now. I'm hoping that you guys have put your questions there because I don't want to do live questions. I just want us to take the questions in the chat. So if you have questions, this is the best time to ask them so that we can adapt this learning, for your style. So go ahead and put the questions in the chat and we'll just kind of put them together and start to answer them. While we are doing that, let me begin to give you some examples of boundaries, right? So examples of boundaries, because remember, we said boundaries are guidelines. Examples of boundaries are, let's say, for example, in your family relationships. Now, boundaries in families are usually tricky because depending on your position in that family and depending on your age and perhaps also your culture, some of your boundaries may be seen as unreasonable, right? So boundaries in families can be tricky because people hold different positions in families. And some people might have more authority than others, right, in the family. So some of our boundaries may not be practical. So let's say, for example, you like to be woken up with, let's say, let me give you a personal example. When I get up, immediately I get out of bed, my day is not going to go my whole day is not going to go as great as it could have. I need to wake up, kind of like boots or defrost, and then get up. So if I wanted to make a rule about that, I would say then that my boundary is that I value having extra time to get up. And so I would like to be woken up with enough time. If anybody has to wake me up, you have to wake me up with enough time to get up. That sounds like a boundary because it's talking about what I want. However, I share my life with my family. And sometimes the practical reality of that means that I need to be woken up immediately, say, get up, let's go, we are late for school. Do you see how creating that boundary in a family that I shared with others needs to be flexible? Because even though that is a guideline, there are circumstances where it is not practical. That is why the boundaries that you have for friendships can look different from the boundaries that you have at work. The boundaries that you have at work will look different from the boundaries that you have in your family. That's why boundaries are not set in stone. There are general guidelines about what's okay and what is not. And navigating how that plays out requires some level of emotional intelligence. Does that make sense? But once you understand the foundation of it, you now realize that as you begin to get more autonomy and step more into your own, you take responsibility for creating those guidelines. Because if you have a shared space, for example, if you have a flatmate, the boundaries you're able to enforce will look different from the boundaries that you're able to enforce if you live by yourself. So for example, let's say you require that the toilet seat should be down all the time, or you would prefer that the toilet seat is always wiped, right? If you share a space with 10 other people, how easy or difficult will it be to enforce that boundary? You then realize that some of your boundaries around the way people use bathrooms, right, will be contingent on where you live, how you live, and how many people you are sharing it with. So does it mean you no longer have boundaries because you share a space with 10 others because that's your position or situation in life right now? It doesn't mean you don't have boundaries. It just means that given the practical reality of how you are living right now, some things are practical and some aren't, right? So let's do the question and answer. What happens if you don't have boundaries? It just means that without guidelines, you are very likely going to be following the guidelines and rule books of all the people who set it for you. You'll be living another person's script and not yours. And while that might be realistic, depending on the stage in life you are. So, I mean, imagine if I was having a conversation about boundaries with my 15-year-old, and my 15-year-old says, what is okay for me is that I only do dishes once a week. What do you think my response will be? In fact, as a person that you are, please put in the chat what your response will be if you know, a 15-year-old that came and said, look, my boundary is dishes are not for me and I'm only going to be doing dishes once a week. I like this response. Share you, they whine me, right? Say louder, right? In whose house? So do you see why boundaries have to be realistic? When you have your own place, you get to make your own rules in your own house. So your boundaries have to factor your living situation, right? But if you do not have any boundaries, what will happen is that you will find out that you are deeply dissatisfied in your relationship. You are often resentful and you are exhausted, especially if you're a person that is generous and giving, because you think that as a good person, you're supposed to be generous and giving to everybody, right? Come to find out that you have to have guidelines around being generous, because when you get taken advantage of, it will hurt and you might feel resentful, okay? Okay, next question. How do we create boundaries when others are involved, especially loved ones, without looking like a bad person? That is an excellent question because that's where majority of boundary work happens. How do we navigate relationships when we share the world with other people that we care about, right? And they're loved ones, and we don't want to hurt other people's feelings. A big thing about boundaries is also about not wanting to hurt other people's feelings. And I wish I could say it differently, but I'm going to be honest. It is impossible to do boundary work without hurting feelings. It's simply not possible. You are going to have to get comfortable with living in the yes and using the emotional intelligence that you have learned to share and communicate your boundaries in ways that are helpful. Let me give you an example. Let's say that my friend just had a baby, right? And I drove from out of town. Maybe I drove 4 hours to their city to go and visit them. And out of excitement, maybe I parked the car and I ran into their house. I just tried to carry the baby. And she says, I would like you to wash your hands. How do you think I might feel? Or maybe I should say, if it was you, how would you feel? I'm not asking for your secondary feeling after. I'm saying immediately, right off the bat, how might you feel? Yeah, you are right. You will be hurt. I will be hurt too. Because that person just set a boundary. They just told me, this is what is okay. Exactly. I appreciate your honesty. Is my hand dirty? Or am I smelling? Do you understand? So it is not possible to set a boundary without hurting feelings. So once you've established that, you already know that it is highly likely that people will be hurt by boundaries. How do I know? Because I also get hurt by boundaries. So it is not good people don't get hurt, bad people get hurt. It is human beings get hurt when boundaries are created. Right? So fully expect to get hurt. Fully expect, I like what you said, but it's a baby. That's a forgivable boundary. You have not met people who get, imagine like maybe a grandma, and you are telling her that she should use hand sanitizer before she picks up the baby. It's possible for them not to forgive you for the rest of your life, right? But is it that the parent should not set a boundary because people's feelings will be hurt? That's why I said it requires emotional intelligence to navigate, because it can really be quite tricky, right? And that's why I said, look, as a psychotherapist, I spend a lot of time in my work helping people navigate these things, because for some of us who are currently offended with other people, it is because of how they set their boundaries and perhaps how our feelings were hurt, right? So everybody could use learning with accepting other people's boundaries and creating, you know, our own. So let me go back to the question to make sure that I'm answering it accurately. What question was I answering? Let me make sure I get caught up. There's something that's not quite clicking. Let's say you don't like to be spoken in a certain way. What's the boundary there? And if someone speaks to you in exactly that way and you don't like it, how do you enforce said boundary? One answer could be restricting the person's access to you, but what if you work together? That's an excellent question and a very practical one. So let's give that a stab. Your boundaries about how you would like to be treated and what you will do if and when the boundary is crossed or violated, right? So you can know that it is not okay for other people to speak to me this way, which means I do not accept it. What is not a boundary is saying, don't ever speak to me like that. That's not a boundary, that's a rule. A boundary is, I do not accept being spoken to like that, or I only allow people to speak to me like that, right? You see how I did that? I do not accept. That's when you say what you don't want. Do you see how I reframed it to what I allow? I only allow people to speak to me respectfully. Now, because other people's behavior will always be outside of your control, what happens when they do? That is the boundary you set for your own self, to say, when people speak to me in ways that are unacceptable, I check it and I correct it as appropriate, right? So if, for example, and you know how we said that the way you set boundaries in relationships will be different. So a boundary that you set for a romantic partner might be different from the boundary that you set for an older adult, might be different from the boundary that you set from an employer, right? Because the way you will check a romantic partner or a peer might be different from the way you would check an employer because you like your paycheck. So that's why boundaries have to apply to the very specific situation, and why it is important to know the principle of it, not just the scripts, right? So if I like to be spoken to in a certain way, it means that in places where I have more power, right? So maybe in a romantic relationship or in a friendship where we're peers, right? When somebody speaks to me in a way that's not acceptable, I can look at them and say, why do you think it's okay to speak to me like that? Is that a simple answer? It checks the behavior immediately and forces the person to pause and think about what they're doing, right? To an employer, it might look different. It might look like thinking about it and then maybe writing an email to address it or checking with them in person later. Maybe perhaps it happened in public. But the rule is for myself and what I will do when other people break that rule. Additional complexity, you've checked the person, but they don't accept and they say get over it. That's a completely different question, because your own boundary about how you are going to be spoken to belongs to you. You're the one who decides what to do when people violate that boundary, which is going to happen a lot because people are going to do what they like. You're the one who now decides how to proceed, which is why if you go to a company has a code of conduct. They made that code of conduct before you came. That's why you must have your own personal boundaries, which includes what you will do when people violate it. You make it for your own self prior. So, for example, if it's social media, when people are being inappropriate, if they're a stranger on the internet to me, I don't engage with them, I block them because their behavior will always be outside of my control. So that is stranger. Next stage is somebody that is close to me. If you're somebody that is close to me, then I check you and I say, why do you think that that's okay? If you're somebody that I rank lower than, I then make a plan for how I can reduce future likelihood of occurrence of that. That's what it looks like, but I am the owner of the rule book and it guides how I conduct myself. And I like the additional complexity of your question. It will look different in different scenarios. Can you share tips for reinforcing boundaries, especially new boundaries with people you've known for a long time? That's the hardest, and that's a really good question. New boundaries for places where they didn't exist before in existing relationships are harder because they can look at you like, why are you acting brand new? That's why it's important that the best time to start to understand and set your boundaries based on your own values is now. Because as you set it, you can then use that going forward, then systematically change. So let me give you an example of this. So let's say before COVID, the Walmart in my neighborhood used to be open 24 hours round the clock. They were always open. COVID happened and their hours became restricted. Family members, since COVID ended, they have limited their working hours to, I think it's 6 a.m. to 11 p.m. They never came back to 24 hours. How do you think I feel about that? I don't like it because we used to be able to go in and out at whatever time, but now we can't go in and out at another time. So I don't like that Walmart like I used to because they switched on me. But it is Walmart's responsibility to make sure that they are meeting the needs of their company. So you have to be prepared that when you switch on existing relationships, things are going to be weird because you've just displaced what we call in psychology homeostasis, right? So let me go and look at the other questions. So boundaries in old friendships, it will require a lot of reflecting because you yourself have to know what the new guidelines are, right? And how you then make a plan of how to enforce them. I'm looking at the other questions. Boundaries at work are hard, especially with a superior with whom you have no choice. That's extra difficult and it can be tricky because if your The same way, it's like if my child should be asking their therapist, how do I create boundaries with my mom, right? They're going to have to navigate it because their well-being is contingent on, certain things that I do, right? So in an employer, so let me put it like this: relationships where the power dynamic is skewed more in favor of other parties makes it harder to enforce boundaries. Often the reality will be adapting and ensuring your well-being until you are able to change the situation, right? Because it's not always the case that you can remove, yourself. I'm trying to catch up with the questions. Where am I? How do you deal with a loved one violating your boundaries? If it is a spouse, how do you do so with them? Your loved ones will violate your boundaries. So be prepared for it to happen. You know why? Excuse me, let me blow my nose. I'm back. Thank you for your patience. Right. A loved one will violate your boundaries, right? And let me tell you the reason why. It is because you share the world with other people. So if you think of it as some kind of Venn diagram, right? In that Venn diagram, there's your circle, which overlaps with other circles, right? And so when your boundary gets violated, it is a side effect or a symptom of what I like to call peopling. Interacting with other people means that we're going to bump into each other. The only way for your boundaries to never get violated is for you to be the lone occupant of an island. Speaking of island, imagine going to Lagos Island, the markets in Lagos Island, and saying, nobody must bump into me. How's that possible? Tell me. Is that possible? Put it in the chat. Is it possible for nobody to ever bump into you? What do you think? No. So your boundaries are going to get violated. So that was why we established from the beginning that boundaries are about guidelines that keep you safe. And you have to be prepared for when they get crossed and what you are going to do about it. So it is not, my boundary got violated, this is not supposed to happen. It will. And the better you are with having a plan prior or developing one as your life evolves, that's how you would then be better able to handle it. Let me give you an analogy that helps as a hack. I don't know if that's what to call it, but okay, no, let me give you a framework that can help you think about boundaries, especially because we've established that other people's behavior will always be outside of your control. And it's kind of like a mental model that I use, that people are going to move how they move. So the onus is on you to move how you move. The onus is on me to decide what I'm going to do about how you move. As long as I make you and how you have moved the center of every conversation I have, I am taking valuable energy from how I can handle that by myself. Does that make sense? Because now I am making my conduct about I'm making my conduct about other people's behavior instead of about the rule that has been broken for me and what I can do about it. All right. I think, let me tell you the challenge I'm having. We're speaking in a lot of abstracts because we're trying to adapt the learning to everybody's situation. And because I'm a therapist used to working with people one-on-one, somebody will be able to describe the uniqueness of that situation, then I'll be able to tailor it to them. So I think that is one of the limits of, a session like this. So maybe what we should do is do a group session with just a handful of people, a few people, where I can then give you a worksheet that you can use, and then we can do like a workbook, and you will leave that session, because that's what I do in my day job. You will leave that session with a very practical tool that you can then adapt to yourself in everyday life. In this very general scenario, it wouldn't be possible. But let me try and address all the questions. Then we'll talk about how we can do a small intimate group to better address your needs. All right, so I'm going back to the chat so I can focus on answering the questions, because I have a very hard stop at in about 20 minutes. So let's look at it. I'm looking at the questions. How do I create boundaries when others are involved? Other people will always be involved, like being friends or attending a party. I don't have enough data to be able to answer that. What if it's a loved one, like a husband, that violates your boundary? Your husband is going to violate your boundaries. And if you're a wife, you're going to violate your husband's boundary too, right? How do you check them, especially when they claim their intention was not to violate your boundary? You know what I want you to do? I want you to write that question down. And when we do the workshop, I will answer it. I will give you a very, very specific. This one is so specific that I'll teach you the hack, because there really is a hack. How do you deal with the guilt tripping that comes with enforcing boundaries? You're just going to have to get used to being not nice. Because especially if you're a woman, you have grown up being taught that you're supposed to be nice and you're not supposed to hurt other people's feelings. But I want you to realize that nice is not a trait to aspire to. Because what nice means is that somebody is telling you good job, but living up to their expectations of the person that you are supposed to be. Question of the day: is that your purpose in life? To adapt your life to suit the script of other people? Don't answer. Think about it. All right? So there's going to be guilt when you enforce boundaries. The same way the people who have to enforce boundaries with you will feel guilty that they had to check you, right? So it's part for the cause. Okay. How can I enforce my boundaries when I'm responsible for many people? How do I maintain my boundaries? Yeah, if you're responsible for many people, let me give you a good example. I'm responsible for my children and their well-being. And my children are very big on touch and being, we're a very touchy-feely family. However, I don't like being touched unexpectedly. So as you can imagine, does that create a dilemma? Because I'm very happy that my family wants to touch me and hug me, but I have a very strong startle reflex, which means that I jump out of my skin if I've been touched unexpectedly. So as you can imagine, I have a lot of guilt around being like reacting suddenly when somebody who loves me touches me, because I know that they mean well. So boundary work like that. Let me give you a very good example, a very good script that you can follow. Looks like, I know you mean well when you touch me, and I really, really want to hug you too. In fact, it breaks my heart when I get startled when you touch me unexpectedly. So I've been thinking about how I can get my own need, which is to be made aware before I get touched, how I can get it met, so I can happily get your own need of getting hugs from mom met. How can we do that? I have an idea. Before you touch me, how about you let me hear your voice? So that way I can expect the touch. So guess what my daughter does now? She does this. Or says, I'm coming to give you a hug. Or is this a good time to give you a hug? Does that make sense? Is that a good example? I'm trying to be as practical as possible. So that came with me knowing myself, and then I could set a boundary about what was okay and not okay. If you're a stranger and you've never met me before, you can do it a first time, and I can be like, how about you let me know before you touch me next time? It's going to look like different from what it looks like with my loved one. Or if it is a one-off thing, I may not have that conversation because I never have to interface with that person anymore. Okay, I'm scrolling to the bottom. Let's see. I'm having trouble. I don't know why my scroll isn't working. Have I addressed all the questions? I'm looking here. Yeah, I think I've addressed all the questions. I think I got to the bottom of it. Or is it my scroll that isn't working? Okay. Oh, okay. I think it's a repeat of the same question I've seen before. I'm oldest child and I'm irresponsible. Various emotionally intense matters end up on my table. Some of them bordering on mental health challenges. How can I find a healthy balance? This is a complex question. It's a question. It sounds like a session type of question, not what this workshop can cover. So we're going to have to move on. But I did try to cover, as much as possible.